Do you believe a ceasefire agreement is more likely today than it was yesterday before we heard this news?
I think it's more likely, but still very unlikely. I don't think that this really changes any of the underlying fundamentals, especially from the Israeli point of view. The narrative coming from the Biden administration has been that Sinwar was the major holdup here. But it's important to remember that every negotiation has two parties. And Netanyahu has been pretty clear that he doesn't see this as the end of the war. I think he said he sees this as the beginning of the end. Israel's objectives in Gaza have always been frustratingly vague and expansive at the same time. It's not really clear what they're aiming at, what the day after looks like. And the goals aren't specific. They've had a number of tactical victories, but what Netanyahu seems to really want is a new face of the Middle East. And killing one leader isn't going to accomplish that. So unfortunately, I don't think this will end up being a turning point.
Well, it's interesting as we consider Israel's objectives here that they wanted from the get-go after October 7th the complete eradication of Hamas. You can take out the leadership, you can take out fighters and try to go after their military capabilities and infrastructure. But can you ever defeat the ideology? Jennifer, I just wonder if this is a chase that will ever truly end.
There's been a ton of research looking at this question about whether or not decapitation strikes are actually effective when you take out the leader. And it varies a lot, depending on the type of group and the context and how it's done. Hamas is a group where I'm really skeptical that it's going to work. Hamas has been around for a long time. They have a very specific set of political objectives. They want a Palestinian state. And that idea, that yearning for a Palestinian state carries through from generation to generation. If you go back about 20 years, 2004, 2005, the Israelis had a similar string of tactical successes where they were able to take out a number of Hamas leaders. And violence died down for a very short time. And there was a lot of triumphalism that this was the end, that they had ended this challenge. But by 2007, Hamas was taking over Gaza. And now you see where we are today. So these types of groups that have these really clear generational political objectives are very hard to take out with just decapitation strikes.
Well, so we should consider the next generation then. On the early edition of Balance of Power, we spoke with Jonathan Panikoff about who the next leader of Hamas could be. And this is what he said.
If Hamas actually elects somebody outside of Gaza, somebody like Kailey Leinz, who's been the chief negotiator since Haniya's death, then yeah, I think it probably does represent an opportunity that you actually could get to some sort of hostage ceasefire deal. But the reality is if Hamas decides, no, we're going to double down and elect somebody like Mohammed Sinwar, the brother of Yahya Sinwar, who was one of the chief architects, frankly, of the tunnel infrastructure, it's going to make it much, much harder.
Do you agree with that assessment, Jennifer? How does the actual geographic base of Hamas's next leader matter?
So I would agree, but I would also expect that this is not necessarily an either-or situation. It hasn't been uncommon for Hamas in the past to have a leader outside and also some sort of military-oriented leader inside Gaza. And in theory, any type of ceasefire would have to have the agreement of both parties. So I would expect that it's maybe not an either-or situation. The other thing to think about when you're talking about the next generation is who's going to be the new fighters. Hamas has lost, by most accounts, a significant portion of its fighters. But about 60% of Hamas, most experts estimate, are made up of orphans from previous conflicts with Israel. And if you think about the number of orphans that have been that have suffered the loss of one or both parents in this current round of conflict, it seems to me that the ground for recruiting new fighters, which is equally important as leadership, is going to be very favorable for Hamas.
That's an excellent point, Jennifer, as we consider the tens of thousands of innocent lives that have been lost amid all of this. The fighters are one thing for Hamas or other Iranian proxies. The money and the resources flowing to them is another. That comes from Iran. So what is Iran's role from here? How do you see Iran reacting to the news of Sinwar's death as it is still awaiting retaliation from Israel?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Hamas and Hezbollah do get a significant portion of their resources from Iran, and those funding networks have been disrupted. And new sanctions are likely coming and have come for Iran, which will affect its ability to get resources to these groups. But again, this is something, these funding networks that are very difficult to cut off permanently. Once you cut them off in one place, they tend to regrow in another place. For Iran, I do think that this is a moment of strategic reconsideration how it wants to move forward. It has both of its proxies, or all of its proxies in the region, have suffered significant losses. And this was a big part of its regional deterrence or its regional strategy. I think that the Iranian leadership is likely thinking a little bit about how to proceed from here. Do you double down on the proxies? Is this the right time to go full in on the nuclear program? Is this the time to build relationships with other neighbors to try to cool things down or take the heat off? I think those are all options that could be being considered.
Well, let's talk about Israel's options as well, because as I mentioned, we are still awaiting Israel's response to the missile attack that Iran launched at it at the beginning of this month. President Biden told reporters today he does know what that response will be and when it will happen, even though he is not sharing that publicly at this time. But what are the different options and degrees of escalations that you see as most likely here, Jennifer?
Well, I think there's three, maybe four main types of targets that have been discussed. One is to go after nuclear facilities. One is to go after Iran's oil infrastructure. One is to hit some sort of civilian target. And the fourth, which I think is the most likely, is to hit military facilities. The targeting the oil facilities, I think, would potentially have ripple effects that would affect the global economy. So I think Israel has faced a lot of pressure not to go that route. Attacking nuclear facilities, not clear it would work, and they would require a lot of U.S. support for that. So that's a place where I think the U.S. does have a little bit more of a say. The military strikes would be sort of the least escalatory and the most proportional to Iran's attack. So I think that's the most likely. I think the timing depends a little bit on how quickly the U.S. air defense systems get there. The U.S. has agreed to provide some more powerful air defense. It's called a THAAD. It's an anti-ballistic missile interceptor. I don't think Israel will take whatever action it's planning to take until those are in place, because I do think they're suffering from low stockpiles of air defense and are concerned about Iran's retaliation.
Well, as we consider the U.S. here, just finally, Jennifer, Anthony Blinken, we understand, is going back to the region. This will be his 11th trip. Do you expect it yields something tangible?
Unfortunately, not really. I think the goal of the administration here is to seize on what appears to be a potential window of opportunity. As I said at the start, I think that those hopes are going to be frustrated. I just don't see a lot of movement. I don't know that Hamas will be ready to deal until they have a new leader and kind of figure out their bearings after losing Sinwar. And it doesn't seem like the Israelis are really focused on negotiation. Their concern seems to be about retaliation against the hostages for Sinwar's death, not about finding a way to get those hostages out. So unfortunately, I think this trip will, like the last ones, be a failure unless the U.S. is ready to use the leverage that it has on Israel. Israel does have depleted stockpiles of weapons and is dependent, much more dependent than it was in a year ago, on U.S. weapons. So the U.S. does have leverage it could use if it wanted to.